We are live on Facebook too. So, well, thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to be back at NC State. I wanted to thank Father Monsignor Joseph and also Harrison Lee for making this event possible tonight, because I was just enjoying life in Italy, so I didn't do anything really except saying, sure, let's invite David and Thérèse here to talk about Thomas Aquinas and philosophical anthropology. So, but I'm really pleased. I'm pleased to have two experts in Thomas Aquinas here with us from Notre Dame, who has been my first home in this country. When I came here in the year 2000 for the first time, I had no idea even about what Notre Dame was. I just knew that there were interesting scholars for my research. And I was very excited about landing in Chicago, because it was the city of the Blues Brothers. I don't know if you know this movie. And then I discovered Notre Dame. It was a great place to be, and kind of still missing the dome and the football games. So, and well, Thérèse and David are experts in Thomas Aquinas. They actually work on very, as you know, they probably work on many things on Thomas Aquinas, but as a specialists, they work on something which is really close to the area of research. I can't really imagine what you talk about at dinner at night.
This is what we talk about.
Right. So, but I wonder what the primary substances are at dinner time. And so, if I understand you correctly, David is more interested in non-rational beings. And I'm not saying that there is any implications in this in your marriage, but and you are more interested in rational beings. Is that accurate enough?
We've got reality carefully divided up
in two, right?
And I'm not allowed to think about rational.
Because for people who don't know the implications, what I'm saying in a funny way, he is trying to study the living beings who are not rational. So. Plants and animals who have soul, but it's not a rational soul, and she is more specialized in us as living beings, so rational beings. And especially if I, read correctly some of your papers online, especially in our knowledge and the way in which our knowledge reveals our being persons. Does that, make sense? Okay. And so I'm really intrigued by these topics. There are topics I myself, spent a lot of time on as a lover of Thomas Aquinas, and so I'm curious. Today, I wanted to challenge them, not that much as scholars talking to other scholars, but as making sense of what they do. I mean, so for example, why they got into these topics and why they think that they are important, but talking about them not the way you would talk about them at dinner time when you're alone, but talking to us and trying to explain to us why they are so important. The topic today is Thomistic philosophical anthropology, which is synonym of the philosophy of the human being. For you might have this terminology closer to your curricula at the university. And it's kind of tricky because some people might translate it also as the philosophy of the human person. But in the Greek tradition, person is not really a present concept. So the more traditional approach to the philosophy of the human person is to looking at the person through the soul and the connection between the soul and the body. But then, through Christianity, we developed the concept of person in many ways that are probably, I don't know if they want to talk about this, but so today, philosophy of the human being can be synonym also of the philosophy of the human person, but not necessarily. And I'm not entirely sure about what they, how they would approach these issues. I'm not even sure if they prefer to talk about the person or, well, definitely not him. Right, but maybe. So why actually, I'm not sure if you want to begin with rational or non-rational. So
Yeah, I think it's better to start with the non-rational to provide the
Okay, the
context for what's really
non-rational, right.
important, which is the rational.
Work your way up to the
Work your
interesting
way up.
things. Right?
okay.
Yeah.
So David, you're
Okay.
your corner.
Thank you very much, Fulvio. And the way I sort of envision doing this is I would just say a few things about the project I'm currently working on, and then and then maybe you would say that some things about the project you're working on, and then we can kind of have a discussion based on that.
So we have to. I want to say hi to two Italian people who are watching us at almost 2:10 a.m. for them.
Wow.
So thank you for being with us, Topo and Marco, right? Okay.
What is that? So yeah, so my goal in my current project is to kind of do a kind of recovery project to understand what Aquinas' theory of what he calls non-human souls are. And it's a topic that is not very well understood for reasons I'll say a little bit about. But the big reason is that it's really embedded within a whole medieval scientific worldview that nobody wants to go back and study because there's a lot of things that are just wrong about it. So I conceive of my project as kind of historical extraction project, that I want to go in, figure out how that basically the physical theory works, and then use that as a kind of leverage point to try to understand what he's saying about animals and plants. So I want to start with a basic kind of fundamental commitment that Aquinas has, and it's as something that comes out of the Aristotelian tradition, and it's called a substance ontology, right? And the idea here is that, well, we could think of it this way. There's generic rules that are common to all bodies, right? The things that are maybe described by the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry. But for Aquinas, it's very important that these rules about how bodies behave are never severed from saying something about the actors that are performing this behavior. So you can't just have abstract mathematical description of, say, gravity. You have to, in addition to that, say what kind of being is performing this action, who's doing the gravitating, so to speak. And the same for all actions, for thinking, for digesting, for sensing. Any action is going to have an actor. You're going to have to. Your scientific theory is incomplete until you've said who the actor is. Now, in addition to that, he also thinks that, and this is where the substance ontology part comes in. He also thinks that the actors are individual substances, and by substances he doesn't mean gook or gump. He means, let's say, individual beings. We might say in more common parlance.
So things like a chair or a tree or a human being, those are the fundamental units of reality.
Mm-hmm. And those are the sort of the most really real things. So a part of your scientific inquiry, part of describing the laws of reality then is, in addition to sort of thinking about the parts out of which those things are composed, you have to look at the wholes which those parts compose. You have to, and those are the sort of the nodes of the universe, so to speak. Those are the things that are going to be most important in your physical theory, because they're the things that are that in a way they're primary, right? And one way you can tell that they're primary is that the behavior of the parts of these substances, like say a horse, like say the part of a horse, can only be understood with reference toward the whole, right? So I like to compare a horse and a house. You might think of, a horse has parts, a house has parts. They seem to be superficially similar. But there's something really importantly different about the way the parts of a house relate to a house and the way parts of a horse relate to a horse. The parts of a house are all doing their own thing, right? And the parts of the horse in a way aren't. We'll see what I mean. So let's say you have a house composed of like stones and some mortar or something to keep the stones together and maybe a roof, right? Well, you have almost a kind of mutual self-interest going on. You could compare, in like theories of economics. I don't know if you're, like something like Adam Smith, right? You have like mutual self-interest. The stone's trying to just behave like a stone. It's heavy. It wants to go down. It wants to do stony stuff. And the other parts, you know, like the mortar's really sticky, and it's trying to do sticky stuff. And it just so happens that, you know, the sticky stuff and the stony stuff put together work towards the interest of the house, but not really because that's what they are. It's just because we juxtapose these parts in a way that makes them make sense, right? Whereas the parts of a horse are really, really different, right? You can't even understand what a horse heart is without thinking about the larger context. Or if you just had a horse heart, you'd say, you know, like, what are the kinds of things in the universe? Well, there's, you know, dogs and cats and trees and horse hearts. And you're like, well, horse heart's not really a thing the way the other things are, because it doesn't even make any sense unless you think about it in relation to, say, the circulatory system and the way that it needs to interact with the other parts of the nervous system and the other parts of the body, right? So this idea of a substance ontology says that the most important things in the universe, the most important kinds of actors in causal systems are these individual substances, right? And
what's important about that, so if you just sort of take that all the way down to the level of the atoms, then if you really push Aquinas, if you were to introduce him to physics in the modern world, and you said, well, can't you just take all of these different substances that seem so different when we approach them? We can just break them all down, and it turns out they're all made of the same stuff that's just sort of interacting with each other. And he would, I think his response is basically, yes, that's true at a sort of explanation of how things work. They work like this at this level all the way down, but you can never give a complete explanation of the realities you're encountering except by putting that back into the framework of the bigger picture of what is this thing. So it matters, for instance, for Aquinas, that these atoms are the atoms that go together to make up the life of a horse, as opposed to the atoms that go together to make up the being of a stone.
Yeah, I think it probably, I mean, this is a little speculative, because I mean, what happens if you sort of resurrect them from the dead or something and speculate about science? But I think it would say something like, you know, you can have general laws that describe things at this really universal level, at the level of what we would call physics today. But those general laws are kind of abstractions, because the real agents doing the work in the system are these individuals, right? Okay. So what I'm trying to do then is go back and think about the physical system the way Aquinas thought it worked, with these four elements: hot, cold, moist, and, or sorry, not hot, cold, moist, and dry, these qualities, but fire, earth, air, and water that they belong to, and the system of the heavenly bodies that has all kinds of crazy, you know, interface with the world here below, and, you know, all this sort of scientific worldview in which these interesting theories of causality are embedded, and I'm trying to sort of pump the theory of causality out of it and do kind of a long-term extraction project. And I'll have more to say about sort of what you get out of that, I suppose, for animals and plants. Things. Oh, which thing about living things?
Do you agree about everything he said?
Yeah, so far so
good. Oh,
so keeping an eye on him.
What about living things?
How far the extraction goes? I mean, do you extract also the individual substances from the picture, or you don't want to disintegrate this?
Well, what I'm trying to understand is how his theory of causality works, right? He says that.
Well, I mean, the way that you say it that I really like is that, you know, if we want to go back and we want to understand, we say there's something important about Aquinas's worldview when he says that he has something really good to tell us about animals and plants and what it means for them to be alive. And part of that is in his soul theory, but people sort of tend to think, well, theories of souls, you know, that's discredited because it's tied to this scientific theory that he had, which we now know is incorrect, is the four: earth, air, fire, water. And so you're trying to sort of peel those things apart and say, can we understand the insights that he has about the soul without, you know, can that be extracted from the other side?
Yeah.
But what about the substance and the atoms? I mean, just to simplify so would you agree with him that the most important things in the universe are the substances, even not the living beings, or, you know?
Yeah.
You would just say that, you know, after all, we can just look at the atoms as the Lego things, and those are the...
Right. Well, I mean, it's probably right. And
I can see your wife really seeing. Let's see what she's saying.
I mean, it's a question of, you know, which things are substances. And I think, you know, if you want to sort of do a translation project, the minimum that he's going to insist on is that living things are still substances. in any system. Now, where you go in between living things and the atoms, right,
a chunk of volcanic rock
a substance. That's a murkier question, and it's murky for him historically.
I'm actually more curious. Okay, let's say that it's very difficult, if not even possible, to determine which ones are the substances in the non-living world.
In the non-living world, yeah.
Right. But then, I mean, my question remains about: do you think that after all, it's indifferent to say that the substances are the most important things, or you would say that just we can look at the atoms and the energies and that's it? So.
I don't think you could look at the atoms and the energy and that's it. Okay. I think that's really the point of this theory. Although there's contemporary theories that are parallel to this. I mean, even PBI with his.
The reason why I'm saying this is that to me it looks like since today it's common to not to look scientifically at reality from the viewpoint of its being intelligible. It's difficult. It's more difficult to see things as a person like Aquinas would, while looking at reality from the viewpoint of the creator. That means, what do I really want? Do I want the mountains and the ocean, or I want a bunch of atoms that can be just put together? If I look at reality, even in the not living world. And if I look at it from the viewpoint of the painter, what am I really doing? Am I focusing on the way the color is made, or am I focusing on the mountain and the painting, right?
Yeah, so that's good, and I think there's sort of two things to be said about that, and one is that if certainly at the level of the human encounter, we don't encounter things as little atoms and electrons and stuff, right? We encounter them as mountains and sheep and lakes and rivers and things like this, and so our descriptions tend to track that level, but our descriptions aren't always correct, and this is the sort of scientific pivot that you have to make, right? So I mean, the way we encounter the sun is as rising in the east and setting in the west, but that sort of initial encounter turns out to be, if not wrong, at least a little deceptive, right? It turns out that the earth is rotating and the sun isn't, going around the earth. And so there's a sort of scientific move you have to make it. And so at an aesthetic level, often what's really important is the level of the painter. It's really important to think about, how am I experiencing this phenomenological feel? How have I encountered it? And if you want to sort of unpack the sort of emotional, psychological, human content, let's say, of nature, then you're going to have to describe things at that level. But if you're trying to account for physical causality, then you have to ask, well, which things are doing the work, so to speak, right? And often it turns out that things that seem like an individual substance, right, might not be, right? It may be
like a thunderstorm,
like a thunderstorm or a cloud or a chair, right? A chair maybe is just a bunch of wood and metal that's juxtaposed in a certain way, and it's a bunch of little substances that are kind of mutually in line with each other, but it doesn't function as a unity the way an animal does. Right? So he's looking for these unities, I think, is the essential bit.
It's true, because what's distinctive of an animal, and one of the things that Aquinas likes to point to when he talks about animals, is that they behave as a sort of whole for their own sake. And so an animal is sort of constantly, everything that's happening within an animal and everything that it's doing is sort of integrated into a life that benefits itself. And so it has a kind of unity that other things don't have. And he thinks that plants also, they have a kind of integration. They've got parts that are all functioning together for the good of the whole. A plant can sort of move, with its tendrils and its roots that are reaching out and looking for water. And so it's responding to its environment for its own good. And so it's doing that kind of sort of self-moving for its own good and adjusting its life. But an animal does that even more at a sort of higher level.
And it's very important to him that the animal is always the source of its own activity. So, for example, and this might seem like a distinction without a difference to us, but he's really insistent on this, that the when you eat, the food that you eat doesn't, properly speaking, act on you. You act on yourself by means of the food, because you're the sort of source of the digestive process that's taking in something, and you're sort of encompassing it in the thing that you're eating in your own life. You're sort of taking it into
You're growing yourself with the food.
You're growing yourself with the assistance of the food, exactly. Yeah, and the same for all vital operations. They're all, in a way, he wants to construe them all as self-motion. So as you go up the tree of living actions and you think about, growth and nutrition and sensation and even thinking, they get sort of internal in this a greater and greater way. You're relying on instruments at the lower level, and then you're performing sort of interior mental acts when you're thinking at a higher level, and you become sort of more and more in a deeper way the source of your own action. Whereas inanimate things are completely determined by whatever is causing them. They're not the source of their own action at all. The only answer to the question, why did the rock, smash into that wall, is because somebody threw it, or because some other thing bumped into it, right? You're always going to look for if you want to analyze the behavior of the rock, you have to look at something prior to the rock. Whereas once you get to living beings, somehow you begin to self-determine, you begin to have like different levels of control over your own action, and that sort of internality increases as you go up the scale to understanding. Yeah.
So, you want to add something about the rational life at this point? Or?
Sure, yeah.
We're already in between.
Yeah,
right. So, the great bridge to the rational world.
And you like that picture, by the way. So
I do. I'm very sympathetic with it. I mean, I'm not sure. One thing I haven't done is really, there's sort of different phases, right? And I'm really trying to, right now I'm in the first phase where I'm really trying to sort of uncover what Aquinas' own theory is. But one question I often ask myself is, what would it take to do sort of a proper translation? What would it, so to speak, in not of the language, but of the theory, right? To say which aspects are really compatible with contemporary science. One thing I think is a non-negotiable for him is that when bodies act on each other, they're contrary to each other in a certain way, that they're opposed to each other in a certain way. And I just wonder about that aspect. Is like, how do we conceive of interactions that happen by either by contact or by, right? You'd have to get like really deep into the framework or the stories that physicists tell themselves to ask if that kind of what Aquinas is talking about as contrariety is compatible or translatable into the kinds of contact theories that we have. And that would be a totally interesting project, but it's not something that I'm able to do yet. It's a little further down the road.
That's why marriage lasts forever, right?
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, and I kind of want to give a sense of like how big. I mean, you can spend your whole life doing this kind of historical work, and then there's other people who spend their whole lives doing this kind of translation work, and and it really takes a community of scholars to produce something really interesting. What were you going to say about understanding or the mind?
Yeah. So when you get all the way up, Aquinas sort of has this vision of something that's sometimes called the great chain of being. So all of reality is organized in this scale of entities that are increasingly powerful in what they can do, and increasingly complex in the kinds of actions they can perform. And you start at the bottom with these inanimate substances that we were talking about, like rocks, and then you go all the way up to God at the top. And something important happens when you hit human beings, he thinks. And so it's not like there's a kind of Cartesian view that, there's just worlds of bodies, and then there's mind, and mind is the different thing. But everything else is just sort of all on a same flat plane, and it's, doesn't matter if it's a plant or an animal, or it's all just sort of stuff, and then there's mind. And Aquinas doesn't see that. He sees that his idea is that rationality, this particular kind of element that we have in our conscious awareness, there's something special about that, but it's part of a scale of increasing complexity leading up to it. So it doesn't just sort of pop completely out of nowhere. so we think, well, what is that exactly that he thinks is distinctive and different about human beings from any other of the bodies that are in this chain? And one of the things that he says about human beings that I find very intriguing and sort of almost poetic, quite poetic for him, is that human beings are on the horizon of the corporeal world, the physical world, and the angelic world. And so we're just sort of straddling both of these worlds in the life that we lead. And the aspect of the life we lead, the truly human life, that sort of is on the edge of the angelic world, is our ability to have insight into what things are. So the fact that we can go around, when you walk around a park, and you're not just sort of taking in objects that are arranged around you that you have to navigate around or take advantage of. You can ask yourself the question, what is that? You see this particularly unusual plant. What is that thing? And you get interested in it, and you can ask questions about it, and you can decide to study it. And this is a distinctive contribution of what he calls the intellect in our human life. And it's not the sum total of our consciousness. We have a sensory awareness and imagination just like animals do, other animals do. But this element of intellectual insight changes the way we experience reality. And so for him, it's what makes creativity possible. It's what makes moral judgments possible. And it's also distinctively an activity that's self-aware. And so it's the component of our conscious life that allows us to use the first person, to think of ourselves as I. So when I experience reality and I'm looking around at this room, the whole experience that I'm having is framed by an awareness of myself as me, the one that is having this experience. So that's the distinctive contribution that understanding makes for our human life, for Aquinas. And because he thinks of this as, he thinks of understanding as being the aspect of the human being that reaches into the immaterial world and is fully immaterial. And so it's precisely because we have that core ability to sort of go beyond the immediate sensory environment, ask the question why, formulate that in a first personal way. I need to know why this is the way it is. That's the sort of rootedness in the immaterial world. And that's why he says that the human soul, what makes the human be what it is immaterial and sort of has this consistency to it.
What I find really interesting about that is he doesn't tack that immaterial, he doesn't think that immateriality tracks consciousness in general, but only just this part of consciousness,
right?
Which is not entirely unique, but it's somewhat unusual.
Immaterial or spiritual?
So the term he uses is incorporeal, so non-bodily, and which is also the term that he uses for angels. So, but you're right about the terminology, because he is willing to say that in a certain sense, even the sensory activity of animals is immaterial, but in a sort of lesser
But I think
sense.
that's part of my work, and I think he's got a very technical meaning of immateriality that's
So
pegged to a certain kind of change.
Are there any material souls?
Material souls? Yeah. Well, so there's material changes. So part of my project that describes different kinds of changes. The word material in Aquinas, I think, tracks changes that happen by means of these four privileged qualities: heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. And he's willing to call things immaterial, or he's willing to call a change immaterial if there's no kind of loss of one of those four qualities in the body that's receiving an action, which is why I think he's got again, to understand what he means by that or why that's significant, you have to sort of understand the framework of the physical theory in which he's operating. But
there's a way to put this, right, which is that if you sort of asked Aquinas, any sort of consciousness, what is that? Is that physical? Is consciousness generally physical? His answer would be yes and no, because he would say, well, there's a certain set of changes that are common to all bodies, and now we would think of them as changes that happen at the atomic level, governed by the laws of physics. But consciousness is another kind of change that happens to bodies that isn't described by those physical laws. So it's a bodily change, it's just not described by the physical laws. And so that's what this specific set of physical laws common to all bodies. So that's the no, that's the yes and no kind of answer that he gives. But the intellect is sort of something beyond all that. So it's not even a change that happens to our bodies. So if you ask yourself, where is my intellect? I mean, you can say where your eye is, where your power of vision is, where your imagination is, it's in your brain. The functioning of your brain is the functioning of your imagination for Aquinas. But if you ask, where's the part of me that does the seeing and the asking of the question, what is it? It's not located in your body. It's just part of you. It's a non-physical part of you.
Has no location.
Non-physical, of course.
Yes.
Which is not material, because in a sense it's very ambiguous, right? Helomorphism involves that matter is composed with something else, right?
Yes.
So every soul is immaterial, right? So from that viewpoint, but bodily is different, because bodily is both matter and form. But then we have a non-bodily spiritual, as a, and that's why some people. I was just trying to make it clear, because some people sometimes, confuse the two aspects. So
right.
I prefer to talk about spiritual to avoid sometimes this confusion, even though we know that spiritual is something that is not body, right? But
and I sort of think of it, we feel like our thinking happens in our head, and for Aquinas, the reason is that what we're experiencing is the activity of the brain, which is the imagination. That's where the imagining is happening, and it's a very sophisticated
imagination doesn't mean,
and it is happening in your head.
Doesn't mean just fantasy. It also means just the mental pictures that you use to conceptualize things, right? That you're going to use.
And the pattern recognition and responses to conditioning that you've acquired, and that is a brain thing for Aquinas. But where the insight is happening isn't any more in your brain than it is in your foot. It's in you. End of story. That's how he does it.
So to make that whole argument work, he's going to depend a lot on making this distinction between these various parts of our consciousness, right? His argument's going to rest really heavily on that. And if you don't buy that, then the rest of the argument's not going to work for him. Whereas other philosophers who think of immaterial minds, like Descartes, don't need that. Descartes just focuses, for example, on consciousness in general, and even the feelings like pain and stuff is enough for him. Is enough to say, oh well, that's the basis for his argument for the immaterial. But for Aquinas, it's really going to depend on whether you construe the understanding, or what the intellect does is different from the mental picturing, different from even the synthesis of the various senses that you have into a single kind of bundle where you tag the thing that you've heard with the thing that you smell, and different also from your emotional life and these things, right? And then the intellect has to be sort of using all those things, but something distinct from it. And so he's going to depend very heavily on that.
And you can take very seriously your research, right? So unless it is too complicated for today, but awareness, you just applied awareness to the non-bodily nature, right? Of human beings, but there is an awareness also in non-rational beings, right? Yeah. So can you develop this a little? So I understand that you worked on this, right?
So basically the worry, but I think what a worry that somebody might raise is, well, you just said that because we're intellectual beings, we can use this first person pronoun and have this experience of ourselves in terms of I, right? But isn't that just what awareness is? How could you have an experience with no first personal aspect to it? And
like if you were a snake.
Yes, and I think for Aquinas, if we were to ask Aquinas, so what's it like to be a snake? What's it like to experience reality that way? He would say, Well,
evil.
yeah,
No, well,
definitely.
You get the imagery and connotations of snakes.
Yeah.
Psychology.
Yeah, and so the thing that would be missing from the snake, besides being able to ask the question why the two things are connected, is the first personal aspect. And so how could the snake have an awareness? Can we imagine what that would be like? Having an awareness of trees and plants and shapes and being a subject in that space. So you would have, the snake has to have some sort of understanding of where it is in its habitat relative to the prey or the trees or something. Can we imagine it doing that without being able to say I? And I think we can. I think I can imagine it. And the way the snake would experience reality is simply that it would have no experience of itself in the first person. So its any experience that it has of itself and its situating of itself would always be in the third person. So the snake would always be talking about itself as it, or he or she, or something like this. And there's an example of this actually in the Pixar movie Up, where I thought they had the same intuition, and the dogs always talk about themselves in the third person. And I thought, yeah, that's actually exactly, I think, how Aquinas characterizes animal awareness. It's all third personal.
But needs to be there, even though it's third personal.
Right. Yeah. Because it has to have some sort of sense of this relative to tree.
Otherwise, you don't have no
mouse.
Even sensing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to add about this first personal as the basis of moral intuition. It's really interesting because once you have a sense of yourself as a self in relation to other things, then you can really reflect on the means and relationships that you use to acquire stuff. So that, for example, let's just say you're the snake with an impulse. You feel hungry, and what are you thinking about? You're just thinking about the mouse, right? But once you have a sense of yourself, you say, well, I'm a snake that goes and eats a mouse. Let's say we have a rational snake somehow, right? And then you say, I'm a snake that goes and eats a mouse. And you could say, well, why do I eat mice? Mice kind of suck, Like I could get and they run away, and I could just go to Burger King, And right, so all of a sudden, once you conceive of yourself in relation to all the other objects, what you have the ability to do is reflect on the ends that you're choosing and on the means that you choose to get there. Whereas one of the things Aquinas says is that animals sort of have a built-in means-end complex, so to speak. They're set up to feed themselves by means of whatever smells good, whether it's a mouse or And so this is interesting to ask whether how this shakes out in in relation to empirical research, right? And whether language and the first person, these sort of markers of rational thought, really do for you to think about means and ends in this different way or not. And that's an interesting topic for reflection.
Which is also connected to having this insight into what is. You have to ask what is a mouse and what is a dinner in order to be able to sort of see that there's other options available.
Many people today would think that that this is a matter of degree, right? Mm-hmm. So some animals have a higher awareness of this and a higher moral perception of things, and some animals have a lesser one. What would you? Aquinas wouldn't agree, right? With that, but what would
he would agree that there's a gradient, but that there's a sort of a gradient with a firm break.
The gradients come in sort of hard breaks of kinds of awareness that things have. So he'd really want to say that being able to ask the question why is not a matter of degree. It's not like just a more sophisticated version of pattern recognition, let's say. It's actually a fundamentally distinct kind of thing that certain entities are able to do. Even though it's close to pattern recognition, and pattern recognition precedes it, you've got to be able to pick out groups of things in your environment and see similarities in order to be able to then ask the question, what makes these things similar and what's important about the similarities?
It's really interesting that there's two strategies that you can have to try to make humans more like other animals, if that's the way you want to go, if you want to sort of go against Aquinas. And one strategy would be to sort of dumb down the human, and the other strategy is to kind of lift up the animal. And in philosophical psychology, that the first one's far more common, right? People, what the temptation is to say, what the human doesn't really do anything other than complex pattern recognition, right? This is Hume, right? And so this is the question you have to be asking yourself: is when you think, am I doing anything more than association, right? Am I doing anything more than having similar impressions affect me in similar ways? Or am I sort of able to reflect on those impressions and realize that maybe the way they presented themselves to me initially was actually not the way they are, and I have to reorganize them in my thoughts, right? Do I have some control over the way? And so much rides on this, right? Because if we just are sort of subject to what we take in, to the way the impressions strike us, then we're kind of prisoners to our own subjective perspective, right? And I think really the ability to do science is threatened. The ability to have intelligent discussion with other people is threatened. Because why? Well, it ends with a theory like that, where all of our thought is effectively association, right? Then I am the product of all my experiences. My beliefs are the product of the experiences that I happen to have, the ideas that have sort of come together, right, to form a certain associative cluster in my brain. And your ideas, likewise, are the product of your experience. But we can't overcome this subjective gap, right, between my experience and your experience. I could try to go through similar experiences, right? But even if I change my mind after doing that, I would sort of be doing it out of a kind of force, right? Because I've been sort of gone through my, like I've sort of followed your tracks, so to speak, and then you've followed mine. But I don't want argument to come down to a kind of mutual force, right? Like, how much can I expose you to my kind of life experience, and how much can you expose me to your kind of life experience? I want to be able to say that, as long as we have a sufficiently common set of experiences so that we know what each other is talking about, we can have that second order act. Well, it's maybe not second order, and you're going to bite my head up. It's okay. But we can sort of look back on our experience, right? And think about, sort of do this evaluative move. And so so that's this.
The ability to do that is really where Aquinas wants to put the intellect.
And he wants to put the big break between the animals,
right.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it possible for us to actually have rational conversations.
And where this would come down is this: he would say ultimately, this is why you can train a dog, but you can't teach a dog, right? This is sort of the difference between teaching and training. And even if you sort of have a human repeat the same thing, like a training, eventually there's this, whether you like it or not, there's going to be like an actual learning that goes on that's more than just a training, that's more than just a habituation.
It's kind of partly empirical, I don't know if you agree, but if you look at reality, when there is the question why, you have a history that goes, for example, from the cave to the skyscraper. In the case of mere, evolution, you don't have this history. You just have some kind of events following one another. But since we are getting closer to our time frame, is there anything really crucial that you think you're missing and you want to tell us all, and also the other friends who we are greeting, who are actually, several of them are watching this from Europe, so kudos, good for you. And not only Italians, actually I'm seeing people from other countries too, but so is there something crucial we'll be missing and it's worth mentioning?
Well, maybe the thing to think about is when Aquinas, the way his vision of the human person is a vision of integration, I think. It's not like we're sort of animals with something else riding on top, but he thinks of us as being intellectual animals. Our way of knowing is a way of knowing that's measured by our animal existence. And conversely, the animal existence that we live, and even the things we do to satisfy our animal needs, are informed by our intellectuality. And so there's really not just this sort of, it's not like a layer on top sitting there, but it's a complete integration that changes everything about how we live.
Actually, before I think that one of the most important teaching we got tonight is that we need to make more Thomists marry one another. So this is a great improvement for scholarship. And just to, a final funny question to go back to the rational realm. And this discussion I had with some... That's right. So how would you, this is a funny conversation I had online with some friends recently. So how would you answer or react to the challenge about the Earth being alive? I mean, let's say that, because if you look at the not living beings from a very small perspective, it's easy to see them as acting, out of external forces and also sort of not harmoniously. But if you look, for example, in the entire planet, or even at smaller scale events in the planets, like the connection between the oceans and the climates, and or the sun and the effects on the leaves, and so why isn't the Earth alive?
We talk about this a lot over the dinner table.
Yeah. But it's got some features.
It's pretty much dinner time. I mean, it's Italian in Italy would be dinner time, not. Here.
Maybe the short answer is that there are people in the history of philosophy, like the pre-Socratics, for instance, who bite the bullet on this, and they say, look, it's an integrated system, the whole thing. And so it's alive. It's like we're all parts of one sort of
benefiting itself.
Thing.
It's
moving.
It reacts to.
Yeah.
If something damages it, it self-repairs. It does some of the things that life does.
And that, I mean, there's something really attractive to that in some ways, but at the end, I sort of we find it unconvincing, because both
this is very important.
Otherwise, we fight.
But
no dinner for at least one of them.
Yeah. But I think the key here, and this is where I find myself very convinced by the kinds of argumentation that Aquinas makes, is that the system is really too big and operates in ways that are not coordinated enough with each other. When you put it into perspective with things like the weather patterns, and even he knows about the solar system, but not, how the solar system is organized, but the planets and things like that. And he sees them as being sort of in the life of living things, but intersecting in different ways with our life due to divine providence, but not as part of a single living organism. So the integration is not like that of a living organism. I'm convinced by Aquinas' arguments on that.
I am too, but it's a tricky thing. I mean, the fact that you can talk about these things as systems means that there's a kind of integrity and a kind of unity there, that they seem to act like substances in a certain way. A cloud has a kind of systematicity to it. So, so it's a problem, but we'll keep working. We'll fix it.
Okay. We'll stay tuned. So we have time for some questions, not online, unfortunately, but definitely from people who are here. So. And if you want to appear online, you can just come to
But you don't have to.
You don't have to. You need to ask to one of them, otherwise they will fight.
We're a hive mind. We can,
okay.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, yeah. So there's a kind of codependence there, and he doesn't think it's this. It's a similar kind of problem to the cloud, right? There's a kind of codependence that's not the same as an organism.
Well, maybe actually one thing. This is like the cloud. One thing is that systems in which where the parts aren't all touching each other, I think for him are not organisms. And so you wouldn't want to think of a family unit or a group as being like an organism, but nonetheless it has a lot of the same sorts of features that organisms do. So there's a kind of interdependence, there's a kind of adjustment that the different members of the family make for the good of the whole. And so he sees, in a way, he sees organisms as a kind of model that social communities should imitate, and that they flourish best when they imitate this sort of organic model, but they're not themselves organisms.
But yeah, but things, you know, as you go up this sort of chain of being, things should use their cognitive powers, or start to use their cognitive powers to do these coordinated things, to live, to sort of mirror in well, in the case of the humans, interpersonal way, what an organism does just biologically. And that's appropriate. And then of course, you know, bees will do this, you know, because of like their little bee imaginations, and, you know, in a non sort of personal way. But yeah, so there's a kind of mirroring of the order of social communities and biological organisms, but I think he would keep the causal accounts of those things pretty distinct, partly because of this problem of contact, right? He thinks action has to happen through contact. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier how he is very clear to make the distinction that when you eat an apple, it's you acting upon yourself through that. How does he relate that to God being the uncaused cause, and then he acts on us and we respond to him in that way?
Book one of the Liberty Causes, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
He even makes that comparison when he's talking about the digestion case.
Yeah.
Because the text I found on the digestion case is actually a text on grace, and he's trying to figure out how grace works. And I'm doing like the opposite of what everybody else does in Aquinas, right? Like, oh, cool, that passage is on grace. Well, I can use this to figure out how, you know, you digest food, right? I don't need to do this theology stuff. It's, you know, crazy. I just want to know how the food works, you know. But you just cut that out, yeah.
But yeah, he thinks of, and this is where, I mean, it gets very, very cool when you think about the relationship of God as uncaused cause to all things, because it's not a kind of billiard ball model where God just gets things going and then things act. He thinks of God as the source of the being of everything that exists. And so that means that everything that's real, and even our actions, are constantly brought into existence and held into existence by God right this very minute. So that means that for him, if you step back and you take the God's eye view, everything that creatures do is done as a kind of instrument of God's constant causality in all of reality.
This is a neat thing, because he's trying to have it both ways. He wants to also preserve the integrity of the instrument. So it says in a similar passage, you know, if you have this relationship of primary cause and instrumental cause, the primary cause can't just use any instrument you like. You can't just put anything in your mouth and have it be food, right? Some things are just going to kill you, you know. So there's a kind of integrity of the instrument. And he wants this, but at the same time, the primary source of the instrument's efficacy is the primary agent, right? So he wants that same relationship to be there with you know, let's say grace, or, you know, other things like that.
Everyday action.
And everyday action, just your ability to pick up the paper, right? In a way, your being is entirely dependent on God as creator and sustainer of your being. And if that goes away, you know, if God forgets about you, you just poof out, you know, out of existence or whatever, right? Like God's actively sustaining you in being, and more powerfully at work in a way in your own actions than you are. And yet, at the same time, he wants that integrity of the instrument. He wants to say,
they're still your actions.
They're still your actions, and, you know, they can't be done by an apple or, you know, by a chair, right? They have to be done by you, right? So he develops this is a whole sort of second part of his theory of causality, just to deal with these kind of instrumental cases. And he builds it right into his physical theory, but he thinks it's consistent with the stuff he says about, you know, like psychological causality, like grace, and, you know, what we do through speech. And so he wants this very consistent he wants a big single picture. I mean, if there's one feature of Aquinas as a philosopher, it's his systematicity. He wants it all to sort of fit together, and that's what makes it challenging and interesting. But I don't know, does that answer your question? I mean, yeah.
An excellent question.
Actually, I think but does Thomas Aquinas' idea, like when you're describing how he views a life as kind of acting on itself and evolving in its own way, does it fall in line with like the seven qualifications of life, like a living organism in biology? Like, does it line up? I'm also not in biology or in philosophy, so I have no idea. But does it line up fairly clear, like fairly with that?
Well, yes and no. So it really depends on the kinds of things you're trying to explain. I mean, and I'll say something and then you can say something. We got this. So a lot of biology is trying to explain the mechanisms for certain things, right? Like how does the stuff work? Like Aquinas is doing a little of that, and he's wrong about a lot of the stuff that he does. But he's also trying to explain the sort of how the how fits into the whole. But some of the phenomena are common. So you get things like digestion. You get things like so vital actions for him are digestion, growth, reproduction, which are all part of what he calls the vegetal life. And these are things that are common to plants, animals, humans. Then you get sensation at the next level up, and what he calls locomotion, the ability to move yourself from one place to another. And he thinks that's actually dependent on sensation for interesting reasons. He thinks that if you're let's say you're a tumbleweed that, I don't know if tumbleweeds are probably dead by the time they move, but whatever. But if you're like a plant that somehow has to move from one place to another just because you're blown by the wind, that's not really locomotion. Locomotion depends on at least perception, because it depends on you situating yourself relative to external goods. Right? Like there's a mouse over there, I want to go eat it. So I must be hungry. But then he also includes things like this understanding as part of his criteria for life. So things that can understand, and he even says that God is life, because God has his own self-understanding, right? So life includes the biological and these biological notions that you're referring to, but it also includes the mental, and the core notion of life for him isn't a biological one. It's one of something like self-motion, or something like you could say self-sustenance is a part of that, but in understanding being, that's going to be self-awareness, being the
source of your own motion,
being the source of your own motion,
activity.
Source of your activity.
Sourcehood really is the thing that gets it done. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You said you got the second one?
Yeah, just regarding applying it to our modern medicine and technology, how would that align with like organ transplants? And things where you're taking a small part that belongs to one individual.
This is where we probably
I think this is,
possibly.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. No, I think this is really fascinating problem, because one of the criteria for being a complete organism for Aquinas is this notion of integration, that all of the parts are working together for the life of the whole. And it's also the case for Aquinas that whatever is doing that is part of you. And so what that means is that you could have when you transplant an organ, and if I have somebody else's liver, right, I can have a liver with DNA that's not mine originally, which is now truly my liver, because my body has taken it up into its life. And so this, for him, this crucial issue here is rejection of the organ, right? Because if the body rejects the organ, that's saying I'm not taking it up into my life, and then you can't, it doesn't become part of you. So I think that's how this sort of theory handles that kind of problem. So what you are is not really even defined by the DNA that you have. It's by what's functioning together as part of a single whole.
Right, and for that reason, you could have these arguments about, and any philosophical system, this isn't like unique problem to Aquinas. Any philosophical systems have to figure out ways to accommodate these things. And organ transplant's a really interesting one. But you could say, well, the organ, you know, if the organ dies in while you're transporting it, it's not going to work, right? But it depends there what you mean by life and death, right? Because you could say, well, the organ's still doing things like cell division and, you know, performing these biological processes. But the mere performance of a biological process might not be adequate to a life. You might only have a life when you're you might only have a life if you're a liver, right? When you're part of an organism, an appropriate.
When you're part of an organism's life.
Right, when you're part of an organism.
Organisms are the things that have lives, not organs.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a question. So there's two ways you could run this. You could either say the organism, you know, dies and then is suitable material for a new host, or you could say that the organism doesn't die, but the life of which it's a part at some point changes.
Well, but I think you could just say it's a category mistake to say that the organ is alive or dead. The organism is either part of a living thing or it's not, and that's all you can say about an organism.
Yeah, that's a third option.
Yeah.
That's a third option. Yeah.
That's the route I would want.
There's different ways to handle this. Like I said, this is not a problem unique to Aquinas, but yeah. We get a couple of.
I would agree. Right?
You've been waiting for a while. Why don't you? Yeah.
Oh no.
Okay. Yeah.
So how is that, we're making that distinction of like other living beings and us humans, and you're talking about like the whole intellectual and like the capability of saying I and all that. But how does the soul play a part of that? Like that relationship, are we different because our soul has that ability, or like
yes?
Because I'm like soul and body. And how does like that relate to that intellectual part?
And why even talk about a soul? Just
yeah.
So you can say,
So Aquinas will want to say that anything that's alive has a soul, and the soul is just the sort of living version of the thing that he calls a form. When everything has a form, and a form is what makes the thing be what it is. It gives the thing, so the form of fire makes it be fire and gives it the power to do fiery sorts of things. And the soul of a plant, similarly, is what makes it be this willow tree that does willowy sorts of things. And so the soul of a human is responsible for our being human and doing human-y sorts of things, one of which is distinctively having this ability to have intellectual insight. So he doesn't think of the soul and the body as being sort of two entities that are pasted together in a kind of Cartesian dualist way, but he thinks of the soul as the kind of integrating force, if you will, that is the being, the humanness of you. And when and the way I like to think about this in terms of the immortality of the human soul for Aquinas is it's almost as though the body just sort of falls apart around the soul for Aquinas. It's not like you've got a complete body that's really like a corpse and then the soul makes it alive and then the soul leaves. It's a single thing, a living organism, but then as the organism starts to malfunction, it eventually becomes inhospitable for supporting this kind of life, but then the life is immortal and it doesn't have anywhere to go, if you will, right? So he sees it more that way than a kind of separation of two things that are sort of different in the first place.
The soul is immortal, right?
The soul is immortal. The human soul specifically. Yeah, in the back, yes.
So is the soul responsible for the ontological being of every substance? And if so, how does that apply to non-living substances?
Yeah, so they don't have, so Aquinas would only say that he would only use the term soul for what makes living things be what they are. For the being of a living thing. But for non-living things, he's going to use the term form more generally.
He thinks souls are a kind of form.
And souls are a kind of form. So if we're going to talk about, say, even something like a sapphire, which is something that he likes to use as an example for some reason, a sapphire has a form that makes it be what it is. And there's a sort of worry that, you know, during the scientific revolution, there was this sort of worry that forms are just like this spooky thing that you postulate because you don't know why sapphires are the way they are and what they do, why they do what they do, So you just say, well, they have a sapphire form and that just takes care of it, right? So once you understand how sapphires work, now you don't need forms anymore. And I think that's a sort of mistake about what it was that a form was supposed to be doing in the first place. Because in this sort of tradition that Aquinas belongs to, a form is not explaining how a thing works. It explains what it is. It's the being of the thing, the constituency of that as belonging to a certain kind. And that's what a form is supposed to be doing, not sort of explaining why sapphire atoms or molecules are bonded in a certain way.
Gaps in your explanatory theory.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
How would Thomas classify someone who's intellectually challenged?
So you have a good, you've worked on this more than I have.
Yeah, I think, so this is something that also makes his anthropology very appealing to me, because he takes being human is a matter of having a human, belonging to the human kind, which is defined by having a human soul, right? Because it's the soul, the form that makes you what you are. But he distinguishes between the having of the soul, which gives you a set of abilities that are typical to being human, and the exercising of those abilities. And so it's possible to have unactualized abilities and still remain the kind of thing that you are. And so for him, it's very, this is where Aquinas, there's a big split between Aquinas and theories of personhood that look at function in order to assess the value of the human, of a creature. So we might say, well, you know, entities that function in a certain way, let's say they're able to do intellectual things, are more valuable than entities that don't do intellectual things, or things that have consciousness, have conscious awareness, are more valuable than things that don't. And for Aquinas, that's not how value is assessed. It's not in terms of what you are actually doing. It's about the kind of thing that you are. Yeah.
Dignity goes with being human, not with like a certain level of performance or something like that.
There's another interesting component to this as well. So he talks specifically, he has different terms that he uses about this, but he's familiar with the reality of a intellectual disability. And so what he'll say is that this is something that has happened in the brain. It's not really, it's a mistake almost for him to call it an intellectual, it's an imaginative disability. And so if the brain were sort of, the organ of the brain were able to do imaginative things the way that it needs to be able to do to function imaginatively, then the intellect would be able to kick in and start asking those why questions. But the functioning of the intellect requires the functioning of the brain in our human life. So it's an imaginative problem for him and not an intellectual problem.
Even in the way its causal theory works, there's no way you can damage an intellect. You can only damage a brain.
Yes.
Are some intellects better than others? Like, are some intellects like harder and
well,
the question is which one?
well, an angelic intellect is better than a human intellect. It's more powerful, it's more able to synthesize and see things at a single glance. And we have very limited ability
I want
to
to
do that.
jump in on that really quickly.
Yes.
What's really interesting is Aquinas is synthesizing a philosophical tradition, a theological tradition, when he's talking about angels. Because his theory of angels is partly coming from, you know, what you see in what you read in scripture and this theological tradition, but also coming out of this school of Neoplatonism. There's all these late Greek readers of Plato would think that there are just minds that are there by themselves, that exist by themselves. And Aquinas mashes these things together. He just thinks that one is an explanation of the other. And this is why they call him the angelic doctor, because he's really, so he's super interested in mind, right? But he, you know, so he has a whole speculative but interesting theory of the order of intellects. And what he thinks makes one intellect more powerful than another is the ability to grasp a complete idea with sort of fewer freebies, but fewer first principles that are given to it. So the less you need to understand more, the better off you are. But, and this is where the big but you mentioned comes in, thinks that all human intellects, just as intellects, are the same. There may actually be differences coming from.
It's from the imagination.
From the imagination.
Basically, so this imaginative preparation, how quick your imagination is to form patterns that can help you do your intellectual activities. But he doesn't think that human beings have any variation in terms of their intellectual capacity.
Except what you train yourself to do later, right? But not raw capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that mean at the resurrection of the body that everyone would be just as smart as everyone else? Because everyone's intellect is the same and everyone's body is perfected?
So
no, because you haven't because you've acquired intellectual habits. There's got a theory of intellectual habits that say that, think about other kinds of habits, like learning to play the piano, right?
Okay.
Even when you're not playing the piano, you carry that around with you, and every time you sit down at a piano, all of a sudden you have something that somebody who's never learned to play the piano doesn't have. And the same is true of intellectual habits. Once you learn to do geometry, that's sort of a permanent character feature of your intellectual functioning.
yeah, but then grace comes in and sort of blows this all to pieces, right? Because
the
then
beatific vision, right?
Yeah, there's the beatific vision, and so God gives to each soul in the measure in which it's able to receive according to the virtue, how virtuous, with the kind of virtuous habits that it's acquired. And so it's entirely possible, not the intellectual habits, and so it's entirely possible, for instance, that the resurrection of the body, someone who has no education at all whatsoever has a much greater understanding by grace than somebody who studied metaphysics their whole life.
Since I want to be invited to dinner, I'm not taking any stance right now. You're both fine. Other questions?
So you mentioned earlier how Thomas views these different substances you can't take apart and just study apart. You use the example of the horse's heart. Does he use this in any applications of like the theology of the body where like sexuality cannot be thought of as a single part, like it does, just like the horse's heart, it doesn't function alone? And does he make any applications in that, or is he?
He doesn't talk a whole lot about it. I mean, this is a distinctive contribution of theology of the body and John Paul II, that to sort of think about how human sexuality is sort of something that's manifested in all sorts of different aspects of our daily life. And for Aquinas, I think he's much more interested in sort of just sexuality as a kind of biological activity, and so you don't get that level of reflection that you find.
I mean, he's got the sense that there's a kind of dignity and ability there, but it's not super worked out part of the theory. He's much more worried about what
this is something that JP2, I think, is really a big contribution.
Last question.
Does St. Thomas Aquinas ever say where the free will comes from? Because I imagine free will as something that's purely human. For example, like a snake wouldn't have free will; it just does whatever its programming tells it to do for its own survival. Whereas humans can make decisions based on like value judgments of whether this act would be evil or good.
Yeah.
Will is third department, right? Free will should be.
It's on that intellectual side.
Yeah, I don't even know. It's not an animal.
There's no freedom in this.
Not have free will, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so your intuition that it goes with intellect is right for Aquinas, and so he calls it the rational appetite, and it's the ability that we have to make choices of means to different ends. And so animals are moved to ends through means. So for instance, a wolf will see a sheep as a means to satisfy hunger, and it pursues the sheep under that aspect. But it doesn't have because of the lack of self-awareness, it doesn't have that component in place to say, what if instead of a sheep, I just went off and did something else? Or what if I laid this very, very cunning trap? And so free will for Aquinas is tied to creativity and to being able to have that self-aware reflection on your own actions.
Yeah, even if you have a wolf that has two sheep, it's sort of bound, Aquinas thinks at least, that it's bound to choose the one that looks tastier, right? Assuming it's hungry, right? And it can't just say, you know, I'm donating my hunger to a cause for a month or something, or I'm going on a food strike or something. It doesn't do that because it doesn't have this intellectual conception, and it can't detach the means from the ends that it uses, and it can't look back from the outside on the ends and ask whether this is a good way to pursue my own happiness or something like that. That's his theory anyway.
Okay, well, this was really fun. So thank you very much. It was really interesting and fun, and I'm also pleased that you all, you know, stayed for that long. We're past our scheduled time.
And I know you guys are probably coming up on finals and have all sorts of work to do, so I appreciate your taking that chunk out of your schedule for this.
Thank you, and I'm surprised that we have so many people still from Europe. So I feel we all feel responsible for you staying up until 3:20 a.m. But it was worth it. It was worth it, and again, we're very happy that we had you here today, and Monsignor Joseph again, and Harrison. Thank you all for making this happen, and until next time, thank you.